While the details are lost to history, mercenary is probably one of humankind's oldest professions. Presumably at some point after humans figured out that using a spear to stab something was safer and more effective than using your hands, someone else would have pretty quickly figured out that it's even safer again to pay someone else to do the stabbing for you. Mercenary companies, groups of paid soldiers, appear frequently throughout human history. And today you can still read ancient works like that of the Greek soldier and writer Xenophon, which tells the story of 10,000 primarily Greek mercenaries who went to war in order to support a claimant to the Persian Empire more than 2,400 years ago. Unfortunately for them, going to war to enact regime change in a foreign country went about as well as it ordinarily does. Their claimant/employer was killed and the mercenaries were forced into a long retreat across most of the territory of modern Turkey. But not all ventures were so ill-fated, and mercenary service would persist as a viable profession for millennia. During many conflicts, the decisive element of a lord or a realm's military power would not be, for example, the will to fight of their population, but instead the quality and reliability of the mercenaries that their gold or other promises of compensation could attract. But in the popular imagination in the 21st century, that's not how things are done anymore. Instead, regular national militaries made up of uniformed soldiers are meant to be the symbols of military power. Without the logistics or capabilities available to national militaries, private military corporations, the modern incarnation of the old mercenary company, were mostly consigned to support, advisory, security, and grey zone operations. They could support or advise local forces or provide security for critical locations, but you can't spend your compensation package if you never make it home. So there weren't many groups out there that would willingly slug it out on the front line against a capable national opponent in a conventional war. At least that was until 2022, when the PMC Wagner took over many of the combat operations around the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. Suddenly the world was treated to a bizarre sight, a major military power openly relying on a PMC to conduct combat operations on the most watched and potentially one of the most vital areas of the front. The fighting in the Donbass at places like Soledar and Bakhmut made Wagner a household name, and not because they'd suddenly grown an appreciation for Richard Wagner's compositions. Instead, it was because, like a story out of the pages of the 1300s, the mercenaries had stepped in where the conventional military had faltered. Buoyed by tens of thousands of recruits from the Russian prison system, Wagner grew in numbers until they were a significant component of the overall Russian combat complement in Ukraine. They developed new tactics, and Prigozhin and Wagner would become both critical military opponents for the Ukrainians defending in the Donbass, but also for the Russian Ministry of Defense, who saw Prigozhin catapulted from a guy who became rich on Kremlin catering contracts to a bloke with a significant public profile, prestige, and tens of thousands of armed killers at his command. This is the story of how we got to that point, an examination of how the Kremlin managed to partially privatize the war in Ukraine, and what the rise of state-sponsored PMCs in Russia might mean for the world and for the war to come. To do that, I'm going to go through a few points. I'm going to start by defining what I mean when I talk about PMCs, private military companies. Then I'm going to put what we're seeing now into historical context. I'm going to look at the history of mercenary companies in Europe, why they flourished, and also why they began to disappear. If you're looking to explain modern events, it can't hurt to look for lessons in the past. Then I'm going to look at the evolution of Russian PMCs, in particular Wagner and others, and also what their deployments pre-2022 looked like. Because Wagner, Patriot, and these other organisations didn't come out of nowhere, they've been active around the world for years. Having done that, I'm going to look at Ukraine from 2022 onwards. I'm going to look at what Wagner and the other PMCs have contributed to the Russian war effort, the recent altercations between the MOD and Wagner, including the very public spats between Prigozhin and the MOD over the supply of ammunition and new recruits to Wagner, and finally ask what the impact of the growing influence of groups like Wagner, Patriot, and other PMCs is, both for the Russian war effort and for the wider world. Because history has plenty of examples of the dangers of allowing various political factions to arm themselves and the conversion of war into a profitable business. Alright, so before we jump in, let's quickly get some terms straight. What is a mercenary, what is a PMC, and how do they differ from volunteers? Because I'd argue mercenary is a very overused term in a lot of propaganda, in part because in many cultures the word is pejorative. Many cultures regard the idea of fighting for money to be dishonourable, and so they're quick to call anyone fighting on the opposing side a mercenary. For the purposes of this presentation, you're not a mercenary just because you are a professional soldier who receives some sort of financial benefit. Volunteer soldiers in the American military receive education benefits after they leave. Soldiers in just about every army receive a financial stipend. That doesn't automatically make you a mercenary. Similarly, being a foreigner fighting in an army not your own doesn't again automatically make you a mercenary. If you're on a 3-month contract, you fight in plain clothes, and you operate outside ordinary military structures, then yeah, you're probably a mercenary if you're doing it for money. But if you're just a foreign volunteer who decides to join a regular military unit, then international law is going to recognize you just as it would any other combatant fighting in that army. Nepalese Gurkhas have, for example, served in the British Army for more than 200 years. Their motto is better to die than be a coward. They serve in British uniform. If captured, they have to be treated as British soldiers, and at the end of their term of service, they're allowed to settle in Britain. Even though they're foreigners and they do receive a salary, they're not mercenaries, because according to international humanitarian law, to be a mercenary, you must be motivated to take part in hostilities essentially by the desire for private gain, and critically, you cannot be a member of the armed forces of either side. It's for that same reason that volunteers fighting in the Ukrainian Foreign Legion within the Ukrainian military, for example, can't be treated as mercenaries but instead as regular combatants. This presentation isn't about them. It's also not about individual mercenaries. Around the world, there are plenty of individuals whose main marketable skills are that they know how to hold a gun or to look intimidating. But that's not really the same thing as the larger PMCs. These are organizations that contract to provide services. You don't really go to a PMC because you want to hire one angry guy with a gun. You go to them because you want to buy in capability, whether it's training, security, or combat support. And it's these organizations we want to talk about today. Alright, so with the definitions out of the way, let's jump into a little bit of history, particularly as it relates to mercenary companies and PMCs in the European context. And let me start by asking you a question that you've probably never asked yourself. Why would you hire mercenaries? And for those of you who have asked that question before, please let me know if I'm ever in danger of pissing you off. But it is a serious question. I mean, if you were a lord or a peasant and you wanted someone beaten up, why wouldn't you just have your own people do it? Why not just recruit and train your own peasants or noblemen and create your own army? And just like many economic decisions, it's got to do with supply and demand and the various factors that push on either one. I mean, on the demand side, there are factors that are in common with just about any other outsourcing decision. A mercenary company allows you to rapidly scale, that is, you can hire a lot of them quickly in time of war, and it might provide you specialized capabilities. They may be able to do things that your national military can't. In that way, they're a lot like professional services companies, except, for warfare. If you're in an organization that needs to overhaul its IT spine, for example, you could recruit a whole bunch of staff to do it, or you could just bring in outside consultants to do it for you. They know how to do the job, they don't require any training, and once the job's done, well, that's it, they're gone. You'll pay through the nose, but you can quickly scale up a specialized capability and then let it go. Then there are other reasons that might drive demand that are a little more specialized for the military field. For one, if they're not drawn from the local people and political elite, then they're going to be disconnected from those same people. And that carries a couple of benefits. One is simply casualty tolerance. That is, how much people care if they go and get themselves killed. If I'm a lord and I conscript my peasants, send them to war and get 10% of them killed, well then the wives and widows of that 10% and many of the remaining 90% might not be thrilled at the decisions I've made. But if I pay a bunch of foreigners to go to war and they don't come back, well, no one's likely to care that much. When they might care, though, is if popular discontent breaks out and I need to put down a riot or a rebellion. If I recruit troops locally from my own population and then others rise up in rebellion, well, then I might be nervous sending my troops in to quell the dissent. If I tell Trooper Surfovich to go put down a rebellion and he finds out it's led by his cousin and his uncle, then my time as Lord may be at an end. But if I send in a bunch of foreigners that are there primarily for my money, well then I'm probably going to get the result I want, as horrifying as it is. And this works when managing elites as well as unruly peasants. From the 10th century onwards, the emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire, had the Tagma ton Varangon, the Varangian Guard. This was a guard unit made up not of local recruits, but instead entirely of foreigners. Recruits from the Nordic countries, from the Rus, and from the Anglo-Saxons. And they were useful not just because they were good fighters, but because they were usually politically reliable. If I entrusted some nobleman of the empire to my personal security and defense, they might be connected to a family which harbored political ambitions. They may be open to influence, they may have dreams of ruling themselves. The world of Byzantine politics was, well, Byzantine, and the risk of being overthrown was always there. So it made sense to have some angry Norsemen around who carried big axes and would do what they were told. If the emperor said that some nobles needed the chop, well, you could be pretty confident that the guard would roll their eyes at whatever political shenanigans were going on and the chopping would commence. And while those are some of the factors that drove the demand side of the equation, there were also those that acted on the supply side. Generally speaking, for example, mercenary companies would thrive when there was a large supply of unemployed veterans or military-aged males with few other economic prospects. Under those circumstances, young men who felt they had little other option might sign up to the military both for a chance to earn some compensation and also for a chance at adventure. Remember that I am talking here about long past history and not at all about modern military recruitment. So in theory, hiring mercenaries would allow you to bring on potentially full-time soldiers who didn't have to return home for the harvest and who may have interesting military specializations. That makes it sound like a winning deal, but it often wasn't. A classic example here might be the efforts of Charles the Bold. He was the last ruler of what was at the time a strong and independent Burgundian state. This was an area between France and Germany that had grown incredibly wealthy, and Charles was determined to be a military reformer and make it militarily powerful as well. He did it by moving towards a more professional, more standing force, which wasn't a bad idea, and also by bringing in specialist mercenaries from overseas, the best of the best in every category. Basically the same way you might expect someone to operate in a game where they somehow managed to unlock everyone else's tech trees. He brought in British longbowmen, German handgunners, Italian crossbowmen, French cavalrymen, and Flemish pikemen. Then he took his all-star, all-arms force up against the old Swiss Confederacy, which was a pretty mono-dimensional force primarily made up of pikemen, and got his shit kicked in. So he regrouped, did it again, and suffered the same result. A lot of factors go into explaining those defeats. There were a lot of issues of circumstance and bad planning at play. But there are also some cautionary lessons that probably remain relevant today. That an army that speaks 6 different languages is going to have a hard time being cohesive, and that a force made up of troops who are primarily there for the money may not be the most reliable when things start to turn against you. Looking at the stories of Condottieri, so mercenary soldiers in 14th to 16th century Italy, probably provides another cautionary tale. It's important to remember that at this point in Italian history, there is no Italy as a national concept, only really as a geographical term. Italy is dominated in this period by powerful, rich individual city-states and small realms, and many of them have certain features in common. They're often very wealthy, while also being filled with people that were generally not too keen on being conscripted into mass citizen armies. And so in a sort of golden era for mercenary service in Europe, many of these cities and states relied on mercenaries to defend them. A city would sign a contract with a mercenary commander whose band of usually veteran professional soldiers would be at their command for a period of time. On paper, this sounds like a great idea. You don't need to get the citizens of the city-state killed, you can leverage your funds, and you can bring in professional and well-equipped soldiers. The problem, however, is because you often had mercenary armies facing other mercenary armies, self-interest and economic motives led to a certain sort of warfare evolving. Dying, the Condottieri worked out, was bad for business. And so writers recalling this period would state that Condottieri would often fight elaborate battles of maneuver, showing off their technical skill, but in the end they'd fight almost without bloodshed. They'd fight to capture prisoners who could be ransomed, or they'd resolve battles through the use of things like bribery as opposed to decisive shock action. That wasn't great for the city-states employing them, but the issue here is that the incentives for the troops and the incentives for the state are very different. The state likely wants to defeat its enemies. The mercenaries want to survive, and they'd rather the enemies still be there. After all, if they destroy the enemy, their services are no longer required, but as long as a threat remains, well, so too does their contract. Much like modern consultants, you could say they were always focused on the upsell. But that's not to say that mercenaries couldn't be good and effective soldiers. While the Swiss were happy to come together in order to smack down anyone that tried to invade the old Confederacy, for example, they were also very happy to put together bands of mercenaries and offer up their services to other countries in Europe. And they took a very different approach to building their reputations to the Italian Condottieri. For many of the Swiss captains, the way to win contracts and earn good fees was to demonstrate that you were the best. That in combat you would be fierce and that you would not break even under the direst circumstances. The Swiss hired on to other armies as primarily pike and halberd formations, and mercenary service became a critical national export. If you were a European leader and you wanted a ready-made army that didn't take prisoners and inspired fear in your opponents, well then you could go contract directly with a Swiss local government, a canton, in order to arrange for a Swiss mercenary force. Competition to the Swiss would eventually emerge in the form of the German Landsknechts. These mercenary units would adopt both Swiss pike and halberd tactics, but also counter-pike tactics as well. Now, these units could have treated each other the same way the Italian Condottieri often treated each other, minimizing mutual casualties and resolving battles with bribery or maneuver. But that's not how the Swiss of that era did things. Battles between the two formations were usually brutal, with both sides seeming to operate under the assumption that the best way to secure further contracts was to kill the other people competing for those contracts. The core point here is that mercenary formations can be brittle, but they don't have to be. And yet, despite the fact that some very successful mercenary units appeared in Europe, as the centuries passed, they began to fade away. Wagner isn't unusual because the idea of using mercenaries in combat is new. It's not. Wagner is unusual because that sort of mercenary service had generally been replaced by national armies for centuries. And there were a variety of reasons for that. The first is that equipment and tactics changed, and as a result, logistics became all the more important. A truly independent mercenary company, or PMC, is limited in their ability to have a secure logistical tail. They're not usually going to control territory of their own, they're not going to have factories and workshops. Because if they do, well, those are going to be beholden to whatever state those factories sit within. And unless you want to be entirely beholden to that state, well, that's a problem. While in a world where the primary measure of military power is the heavily armoured knight or horseman, that might be okay. You can have skilled craftsmen travelling with the mercenaries to repair the armoured plate, to feed the horses and care for the animals. But what do you do once countries start rolling out large numbers of firearms and cannons? Those on one hand make battle a lot more dangerous for your mercenaries who otherwise might survive on the back of their high quality equipment and skill, but also means if you want to be independently effective, well then you need gun workshops, you need large supplies of powder and ammunition. States are better able to carry those burdens than individual companies or mercenary units. Even today, looking at the forces available to PMCs, you'll find an awful lot of light infantry, and very few things like self-propelled guns and MLRS systems, unless of course it's Wagner, but we'll get to them later. At the same time as being a mercenary was getting more expensive, more dangerous and more difficult because of the evolution of tactics and equipment, national militaries were also improving. Remember, the competition to mercenaries or PMCs isn't just other mercenaries, it's also national militaries. And through the Renaissance and Napoleonic era in Europe, national militaries become more and more significant. They transition from being feudal levies to semi-professional or entirely professional forces. You see the development of national military schools, training and education for officers, and governments that are capable of organising and regulating larger and larger forces. Now again, states have the economic resources available to do things like that. They can afford to set up military academies and training programs. Trying to match those investments or economies of scale as a private corporation, well, that's difficult. Especially as increasingly over time, countries begin to think of themselves as, well, countries, and become more keen to concentrate force in a national army as opposed to a bunch of mercenaries who might change sides. It's only one example, but during the heyday of the Spanish Empire, the army used both mercenary units and also professional units of volunteer infantry soldiers. As a general rule, the records suggest that the latter consistently performed better. If nations hired mercenaries because they lacked the capability to do the job themselves, well, as they developed those capabilities, mercenaries became less and less significant. And then as you start to look at the 19th and 20th century, you have the emergence of ever more complicated systems of conscription and mobilization. And this again starts to supplant some of the utility that mercenaries once had. For one thing, mercenaries are a heck of a lot more expensive than conscripts. And so a state trying to fight a war at an industrial scale is going to be much better off accessing manpower by conscripting it from the domestic population than trying to buy it in from abroad. And the advent of mobilization systems, well, that solves part of the scalability problem. Remember, one of the advantages of hiring mercenaries is that you could do it during an emergency in order to increase the size of your force for wartime, and then get rid of it when the war was done. Mobilization achieved basically the same thing. During peacetime, you could have the standing army active, and during wartime, you could call back the reservists and increase the size of the army several times over. As nations grow wealthier and more organized, capable of calling up hundreds of thousands or even millions of men in the event of war, well, there really was no way for mercenary soldiers to compete. Plus, for reasons that I'd hope are pretty understandable, most nations decided that they would rather trust their defense to their own militaries than troops that were literally in it for the money. Having troops that might be tempted to switch sides if they received a good enough financial offer from the other side would be dangerous at the best of times. But personally, for example, I can't think of anything more horrifying as a concept than a mercenary nuclear weapons operator. Politics, economics, and technology had all come together to make sure that national militaries were ascendant. By the time of the great European wars of the 20th century, the time of the mercenary company in Europe was long over. But here's the thing, trends don't only go one way. The kinds of factors that encourage countries to hire mercenaries remain constant even if they were suppressed in Europe itself. And when they did re-emerge, well, then mercenary units often re-emerged with them. During many of the wars in Africa or South America during the Cold War era, for example, mercenary units would re-emerge. These were often conflicts where national militaries weren't endowed with a huge amount of capability, where fighting didn't rely on massive uses of heavy equipment and artillery ammunition, and where leaders might value the disconnect between mercenary units and the local population. If it came to plugging the Fulda Gap in Europe against an armoured thrust by the Warsaw Pact, a few hundred mercenary veterans wouldn't make a difference. Indeed, as the first nukes went off, they probably wouldn't have even been noticed. But in series of revolutionary, brushfire, or counterinsurgency conflicts around the world, well there, in cases where national militaries weren't up to the task, a few hundred veteran soldiers might make a difference. PMCs would begin to take on other tasks as well: training, site security, VIP protection. But those are very general statements. This video is meant to be about Wagner, so it's time to finally pivot and talk specifically about the evolution of Russian PMCs. And this story begins, as so many others that I have told, by pointing out that the 1990s weren't a great time in Russia or much of the former Warsaw Pact. It would be hard to think of a better recruiting environment for private military contractors than the Russian Federation in the immediate post-Soviet collapse era. On one hand, the demand for security and military services was there, with rising crime and the outbreak of several regional conflicts. On the other hand, the military and police force were in a state of shambles, and there were lots of unemployed former soldiers and security services personnel out there with limited economic prospects. The number of security firms providing bodyguard services starts to rise, and also Russian volunteers and organizations fight in a number of regional hotspots, including in the Balkans. Some sources would go so far as to classify the security company Rubicon as Russia's first PMC. Rubicon was very much a creature of the times. It was led by Yuri Belayev, someone who was linked to the Russian mafia, and who had been involved in a number of criminal-related scandals in St. Petersburg, according to the Jamestown Foundation. In 1992, Belayev had registered the Russian National Republican Party, a right-wing political organisation patterned after an old Imperial Russian organisation of the same name. I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear that's not the last time that there are close relationships between a PMC, criminal organisations, and the Russian nationalist right wing. It's important to note, however, that PMCs in Russia remain illegal, and while security firms can exist, true PMCs officially can't. And so through the 90s and early 2000s, PMCs are generally kept small and controllable. And yet, from the 2010s onwards, Russian PMC activity seems to increase, both in terms of the number of organisations and their size and activity. These firms exist in a legal grey zone, either not registering at all or registering as an entirely different type of business. Wagner Group, for example, is a management consultancy firm, at least as far as its Russian corporate registration reportedly goes. It's important to stress that these apparent Russian PMCs of the early 2010s aren't really major players on the global scale, certainly not compared to the Western PMCs that grow immensely in terms of size and revenue supporting operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. For some strange reason, the US government wasn't really keen to pay good money to bring on Russians in order to support its operations. And so when it came to competing for really profitable contracts, most Russian PMCs generally weren't considered great commercial successes. Several Russian political leaders lamented that Russia had missed the boat and that Western and other PMCs now dominated the market. But there were a few factors that seemed to distinguish Russian PMCs from many of their competitors. On one hand, they seemed more willing to accept direct frontline combat service roles. Western PMCs might do base support, defend an installation, or protect VIPs, or protect convoys. But when it came time to kick down doors and clear neighbourhoods, you'd send the proverbial or literal Marines. Russian PMCs have seemed more willing to blur that distinction. And the second key thing that sets Russian PMCs apart is the degree to which they're closely tied to the Russian state. Now here I want to stress that everything I say in this presentation, both up to this point and from here on, is personal opinion based on the best information that I have available to me. When it comes to things like this, nothing should scare you more than someone on the internet speaking with absolute certainty. But on this point, I'm relatively confident. Russia's PMCs operate in a legal grey zone, and Russian government figures have historically repeatedly denied any state involvement with their activities. But when it comes to organisations like Wagner, I'd like to humbly suggest that that is complete bullshit. For one thing, Wagner bases are often co-located with critical, sensitive Russian military infrastructure. You have satellite imagery there of a major Russian military base with the Wagner PMC base just there. What's actually not pictured off to the lower left-hand side of that image is a short-range ballistic missile base. So let me ask you a question. If you were the Russian government and you really had nothing to do with Wagner Group, would you let them build a base next to one of your bases, which housed a massive armory and was also right near a sensitive short-range ballistic missile location? There's also the fact these PMCs seem to receive heavy equipment from the Russian military. Wagner operates fixed-wing aircraft, tanks, self-propelled guns, and all sorts of heavy equipment. Prigozhin is rich, but he can't just buy that off the shelf at the local supermarket. It has to come from somewhere. And seeing as Wagner often seems to co-locate with Russian military forces and coordinate with Russian military forces during deployments in places like Syria, I have to imagine that the Russian military would have noticed all of this equipment that Wagner happened to have if they weren't meant to have it. I mean, I've been known to criticize the capabilities of the Russian military and intelligence services in the past, but I think even they could figure out that most management consultancy firms aren't meant to have enough firepower to level a city. In short, these are clearly state-sponsored organizations with tight links to the Russian military and government. The US Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, for example, assesses that Russian PMCs are used as a force multiplier to achieve objectives for both government and Russia-aligned private interests while minimizing both political and military costs. Alright, so if these organizations are aligned with the Russian government, well, what are their roles? What does the government use them to do? And here the CSIS identifies 6 main missions that are given to PMCs. There's a paramilitary role, so where they're sent in to train, equip, and enable host nation security forces. They have a direct combat role, where they go in and do the combat operations themselves. They have an intelligence and reconnaissance role, often through those PMCs that are linked to the GRU. They provide protective services for government officials that Russia wants to have protected, perhaps until the point that Russia no longer wants to have them protected. It's kind of convenient if you control the person's bodyguards. And they also do site security, propaganda, and disinformation operations. That site security one is a big one that we'll come back to later when we look at Wagner's deployments. In short, Russian PMCs do both traditional PMC roles like training and support, protective services, but also roles traditionally reserved for militaries, like direct frontline combat actions. In other words, despite totally not being part of the Russian army, they do a lot of jobs that would normally be reserved for, well, the Russian army. As for why Russia would use PMCs in this way, well, there's a number of reasons. Putin himself gave us a clue in 2012 when, in response to a question from a member of the Duma in relation to the potential foundation of Russian PMCs, Putin said, "I think that this is indeed a tool for realizing national interests without the direct participation of the state. You are absolutely right." Realizing national interests without the direct participation of the state are the critical words there. Russian PMCs enable the Russian government to go into and militarily influence situations in a deniable fashion. The Russian government can send PMCs in to affect a situation by force, and if they do something that looks bad on the international stage, well, the Russian government can just throw its hands up and say, "That wasn't us." Putin did exactly that in 2019 in relation to some of the actions by Russian PMCs in Syria. He admitted that they were there, but then said, "Hey, this is not the Russian state." The ability to do those sort of deniable operations is critical in a world of hybrid and grey zone warfare, a topic I hope to tackle one day. Then there's the fact that deploying PMCs is actually relatively cost-effective compared to sending the military. PMCs often have a limited logistical tail, they don't take a lot of heavy equipment, they can often, self-fund their deployments by accepting payments or stealing resources from the areas they're deployed to, and in the event that they become casualties, and many Wagner troops before the deployments to Ukraine did become casualties in their overseas deployment, well, that's okay because those aren't Russian military troops being lost. If a Russian military deployment fails or its troops are killed, that's an embarrassing failure. If a bunch of contractors get wiped out, well, you shrug and you move on. Then there's a combination of internal and external political concerns. In terms of external politics, it provides the Russian government a means to have a military presence around the world and to intervene in various situations without looking like an imperial power that's sending its military around the world. And then in terms of internal politics, well, PMCs and the revenues they create provide a mechanism for rewarding or increasing the power of specific influential leaders or power blocks. Allowing Wagner to exist has made Prigozhin more powerful and wealthier. That sets him up as a counterbalance to other actors. But at the same time, because of the legal status of PMCs under Russian law, someone who is allowed to run a PMC understands that if the leadership ever decides to stop turning a blind eye to their operations, then they may end up in prison and their organization shut down, basically overnight. When you operate a technically illegal business, your wealth, power, and influence exists only as long as Putin allows it. And as perverse as it sounds, in the Russian system, you could argue that's actually a strength of the current model. ENOT Corp is one example. It's an acronym that stands for United People's Communal Partnerships in Russian, but since ENOT also means raccoon in Russian, well, the group's logo looks an awful lot like an angry raccoon. The group was founded by Igor Mangushev. This bloke was a far-right extremist who posed on stage with the skull of a Ukrainian serviceman and described the goal of the Russian war in Ukraine being the elimination of the Ukrainian identity or words to that effect. He allegedly worked with Prigozhin for a while as a political strategist, while also bringing together a variety of right-wing militias and bringing them together for the purpose of basically shared services and administration. Because even right-wing extremists need to get the payroll right. The group provided mercenary service but also ran training and indoctrination camps, not just in Russia or the Donbass, but also abroad in places like Serbia. In 2018, Serbian police shut down one of their camps because children as young as 14 were participating, and as you can probably imagine, that raised some serious concerns. The group's activities seem to have been too much even for some in the Russian government. The treasurer received a 10.5-year sentence for extortion in 2021. Another leader, Roman Telenkovich, was sentenced in 2022 for a variety of crimes, and the leader himself was shot and killed in Ukraine under fascinating circumstances by a close-range gunshot to the head at a checkpoint far behind Russian lines. If you don't have powerful political patrons ready to protect you from the law or more direct actions, then running a PMC in Russia may not be a pathway to a long and free life. Which brings us to Wagner itself and its long history of operations. I'll stress here that as a shadowy mercenary group, Wagner doesn't keep particularly deep and detailed public records. So treat everything that follows as various degrees of speculation, but here is what I think we believe. There are various precursor organizations to Wagner in its earliest form, in particular the so-called Slavonic Corps, but due to time limitations we're going to skip over those to 2014. Long before Yevgeny Prigozhin had admitted that he financed Wagner, the focus was on its apparent commander, Dmitry Utkin. Utkin was a lieutenant colonel in the GRU Spetsnaz. He quit in 2013 and reportedly founded Wagner in 2014. Wagner reportedly was Utkin's call sign, hence the name of the organisation. There are a couple of clues out there that suggest that Utkin might have right-wing sympathies. His call sign was taken from the Nazis' favourite composer. Oh, and he apparently has SS runes tattooed on his body and a Reichsadler tattooed on his chest. I mean, who else would you want to put in charge of denazifying Ukraine? Utkin and Wagner were apparently active in Ukraine in 2014, where there's some pretty solid evidence that they were acting in coordination with the Russian military. The CSIS, for example, reports that he was taped communicating with GRU Colonel Oleg Ivanikov and also Major General Evgeny Nikiforov, who was the Chief of Staff of the 58th Army. He's also received 4 Orders of Courage and been photographed at an event where he and others were honoured by Putin, and managed to make it onto the international sanctions list in 2017. I've got an extract from his file there. So when you look at Wagner in the early era, it's apparently led by Dmitry Utkin, it's co-located and tightly linked with the Russian GRU, and it's also relatively small, somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 troops. That's a far cry from the Wagner that we know today. It's also a far cry from the strength of some of the largest Western PMCs. But as we're about to find out, that didn't stop them deploying all around the world. Now remember, according to some pro-Russian propaganda, Russia is an anti-imperialist power that doesn't go around the world intervening in the affairs of other countries. So let's go through some of the times in the last 10 years that they have deployed PMCs overseas in order to influence events in foreign countries. After the 2014 conflict in Ukraine, the deployment to Syria is among Russia's most famous and longest lasting. PMCs began deploying in 2015 alongside the regular Russian military with an approximate manning level of between 1,000 and 3,000 personnel. This wasn't just Wagner, it was a grab bag of various Russian PMCs, and they provided a variety of services. They advised and trained Syrian and Palestinian forces, they directed combat operations including ground assaults, they provided intelligence and forward air controller roles. That is, PMCs would embed in Syrian units and they would be the ones calling in fire support from the Russian Air Force. And of course, they would provide quote-unquote site security for resource installations and other critical infrastructure. The reported deal in many cases here was that if Wagner or another PMC could assist the Syrians in taking back, for example, an oil production facility, and then secured that facility, well, they would get a cut of the profits. And while these PMCs may be state-sponsored, that doesn't mean that their oligarch owners don't like a good payday. And so get ready for a theme to emerge over the next couple of deployments of Russian PMCs being pulled towards resource installations and extraction deals like moths to a flame. But as well as being geopolitically significant, the deployment of forces like Wagner to Syria has implications that we're still feeling in Ukraine to this day. For one thing, it's one of the places where the tension between Wagner and the MOD that we'll talk about later was born. Wagner, for example, claims to have been critical in the taking of the city of Palmyra in 2017. And yet, Prigozhin loudly complains none of his troops ever received the medal minted by the Russian MOD for the capture of the city. Instead, Wagner sources claimed the MOD tried to essentially steal credit for their operation and their efforts. The extent to which that's true doesn't really matter. What matters is that the tension appears to be real. And in other cases, it goes beyond tension to outright recriminations. We've talked before, for example, about the Battle of Kasham. This was a situation where a combined Wagner-Syrian force crossed over one of the informal lines separating American and Russian troops. As some Wagner sources tell it, when the Americans contacted the Russian MOD to ask whether or not any Russian troops were in the relevant area, they said no. Some even claim that the Russian MOD had agreed to provide support for the operation and never did. And with the Americans apparently being told that there were no Russians in the target area, they lit the entire force up. Wagner was forced to retreat, having suffered casualties. And for some reason, some of them seem a little bit bitter about that. Now, this is the last time that I will stress that this deployment wasn't entirely a Wagner deployment. Very few of the ones I'm going through here are. But the world of Russian PMCs is so complicated and so messy that I'm not really going to be able to dwell on it. Here's an example, just one example of how messy it can get. In 2015, a Russian businessman called Igor Stromolov registered something called Legatko in Moscow. Stramilov had been in the pharmaceuticals business, but his company was being wound up, and so it seems he decided to go into the private security and mercenary business, which suddenly makes me very nervous about what Jeff Bezos will do if we ever stop buying shit from Amazon. Amazon Strategic Services would be a sight to behold. In any case, Legat Corps shares a business office location with another PMC called Vegasy. An individual who describes himself as a director of Vegasy, Anatoly Smolin, was cited in Syria, and also apparently has a Legat Corps email address, which instantly raises the question of whether or not Vegasy and Legat Corps are indeed different companies. Is Stramilov linked with Vegasy? You can see the complications. Funnily enough, Stramilov apparently also created a profile, according to the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab, on a Ukrainian dating website in order to try and recruit administrative personnel for Vegasy. I'm not sure if swipe right to hire company lawyer is really a viable recruitment strategy, but I don't know whether he succeeded or not. My point is that outside the major names like Wagner, there is a sea of smaller PMCs that seem to be interrelated with each other that shut down, rename themselves, and get recreated almost at will. And while I won't focus much on them from here on out, just be aware that they're there and active. Russian PMCs also deployed to Libya, and by 2017 they're described as being the linchpin of Russian strategy there. They fulfill a variety of roles, but the main one is supporting the Russian-backed government in eastern Libya. In particular, the Libyan National Army, led by General Haftar. The performance of Wagner and other PMCs in Libya is a mixed bag. They have a large initial impact. Their snipers and artillery spotting do prove to be a force multiplier. There are 800 to 1,600 Russian PMCs, and the LNA is only about 7,000 strong, so that makes sense. They also show that they're willing to play multiple sides in the same conflict, even though they're backing Haftar a majority of the time. Russian PMCs are also implicated in organising anti-Haftar events. It's also notable that Russian PMCs in Libya do suffer some significant reverses. When Turkey intervened and threw additional support behind the internationally recognised government, the GNA, the result was relatively significant losses for the PMC contingent. In 2017, Wagner are apparent actors in Sudan. Here, Russia demonstrated its taste in foreign leaders by working with President Omar al-Bashir, who had been convicted in 2009 for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity by the ICC. In Sudan, you see a pattern we're about to see a lot more of. Wagner went in to provide military and political support to Bashir and his government. In exchange, a company called M-Invest, which was linked to Prigozhin, got significant gold mining concessions. In exchange for allowing Prigozhin and the Russians to profit off the country's mineral wealth, then Wagner would provide some muscle for the Sudanese regime. Meanwhile, the Russian government was able to stymie US influence and potentially secure basing rights. The Central African Republic deployment had some similar themes, and I truly feel like I'm doing this a disservice by giving it only a single slide. People tend to consider Africa as a monolith rather than as a massive continent with a huge number of people and nations, each with their own stories. And within that tapestry of nations, the people of the CAR have suffered a lot more than most. The country suffers abysmal poverty and has been in civil war since 2012, but it has immense mineral riches. In 2021, the government struck a deal with Russia for support in exchange for resource concessions. Wagner and Patriot both reportedly deployed. They achieved some gains for the government against rebel forces, but not a decisive impact. Instead, it seems Wagner spent much of its time forcibly securing control over gold mines. That often meant brutal treatment of local populations. These resource locations weren't empty in many cases, they were being exploited by artisanal miners, local people, and reporting suggests that they were in the way of Wagner's plan for those particular resource deposits. What is for certain is that the war in the CAR continues. The Russian PMCs have not solved that problem, but they have guaranteed a profitable flow of valuable resources out of the CAR to their financial benefit. And if you're picking up the theme that the deployment of Russian PMCs is seldom decisive for the conflict they're deployed into, well then let me tell you about the 2019 deployment to Mozambique. Because Wagner liked to portray themselves as the musicians, these super soldiers. But in Mozambique, they got their asses kicked. The story started off as many before. Wagner deploys in 2019 to support Mozambique against an insurgency in exchange for concessions on natural gas, diamonds, resources, etc. Wagner forces have to try and do counterinsurgency operations in the bushland of northern Mozambique, and it turns out that Russian troops are not the best at counterinsurgency and bush bashing. They struggle to cooperate with local forces, they struggle to make ground, they suffer casualties in ambushes, and they eventually have to call for reinforcements, but it's too late because the whole thing falls apart. In 2020, they're basically fired, and Mozambique instead hires a South African-based PMC to replace them instead. I could go on, but hopefully you get the picture. The map on the right shows all of the locations where Russian PMCs are known or suspected to have been active. Over the last decade, they've deployed around the world to support friendly regimes, and importantly, to get rich and secure resource concessions. Geopolitics and countering European or American influence is surely part of it. But it can't be a coincidence that everywhere Wagner and Russian PMCs go, they seem to end up seizing control of oil derricks, diamond mines, gold mines, and various other resource operations. These conflicts are often very, very messy, and they often seldom result in a decisive victory in favour of the party that Russia has supposedly intervened on the part of. But the deniability of these organisations meant that wasn't a problem. Military failure didn't matter if they weren't Russian troops. Crimes against civilians didn't matter if they weren't Russian troops. And so the deployment of these Russian PMCs overseas continued to grow until 2022, when the war in Ukraine changed everything. Because in Ukraine, Russia wouldn't be fighting a small regional conflict or a counterinsurgency. This was going to be peer v peer, nation-on-nation warfare, and it was going to test Russia's PMCs in a very different way. Wagner troops had been involved in Ukraine in 2014 in small numbers. In 2022, they deployed once again. Initial reports around March were of relatively small Wagner contributions, perhaps 1,000 mercenary troops going in to support the Russian military effort. These, according to British Air Vice Marshal Mick Smith, were troops that likely had to be reprioritised for Ukraine at the expense of operations in Africa and Syria. But as we all know now, Wagner's role quickly evolved. It wasn't going to stay a small 1,000 troop force doing specialised tasks for long. The Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin, who had outed himself as the owner and financier of Wagner Group, first increased conventional recruitment for the group, and then started going around the Russian prison system offering inmates a choice. He said that if prisoners would agree to join Wagner, then for 6 months they would serve in the most dangerous roles the PMC could find them, primarily as frontline infantry. But at the end of 6 months, if they survived, well that's it, they would be freed. Now, we all know that as the plot of Suicide Squad, but I'm going to assume Russian prisoners hadn't seen the film, and as a result, they signed up by their tens of thousands. Estimates of Wagner manpower grew from 1 to 5,000 before the war, to as many as 50,000, of whom 40,000 were prisoners from the Russian penal system. Those numbers are partly backed up by the fact that in 3 months alone in 2022, the Russian prison population apparently declined by 20,000. Now, either Vladimir Putin was signing a lot more pardons or Yevgeny Prigozhin was paying those prisons a visit. And tens of thousands of Russian murderers, rapists, and serious criminals were given a chance at a new rehabilitation program outside the Ukrainian town of Bakhmut. The transformation of Wagner during this period is hard to overstate. The group goes from a fraction of a percent of Russian troops fighting in Ukraine to a serious percentage of its overall deployed military manpower. It takes over predominant responsibility for one of the most important and media-watched elements of the front, the battle around Bakhmut. And as well as new manpower, it begins to absorb heavy equipment, 2S-7 Pion heavy artillery systems, tanks, APCs, IFVs, and even its own aviation. And against the backdrop of Russian retreats, withdrawals, and defeats elsewhere, Prigozhin and Wagner made the pitch that while it would be costly, they could deliver at least slow incremental progress where no one else could. We've talked before about how Wagner fights and how it's different from the ordinary Russian military. There are some factors in common. Wagner makes very heavy use of artillery just as the regular Russian forces do. But Wagner infantry assault tactics were different. You can see my video on Bakhmut for more details. But at a basic level, Wagner would push forward its prison conscripts in order to draw fire and identify weak points in Ukrainian positions. The casualties among those personnel were horrific. But where gaps or weaknesses in Ukrainian positions were identified, the elite members of Wagner with relatively good equipment, including night vision and thermals, would go in to exploit that weakness, supported by drones and artillery. Those tactics obviously caused Wagner to burn through an awful lot of manpower, but they did allow it to make slow incremental gains, albeit gains that were only enabled by a brutal system of discipline that Wagner and its enemies both describe in much the same way. A system of discipline so intensive that it would motivate troops to go forward even to almost certain death. That system of discipline is hardwired into Wagner's culture. Now, I'm not an anthropologist, but I imagine in years to come there will be people who want to study Wagner's culture in detail. But on the surface, it seems to combine elements of Russian prison culture, which is perhaps not unusual given it recruits from prisons and Prigozhin himself spent time behind bars, with a system of discipline that, as I said, probably belonged more in the Stalinist era. Retreating without orders is cause for summary execution. Disobeying orders is cause for summary execution. Surrendering to the enemy and then being recovered in a prisoner exchange, well, that too may be reason for summary execution in an overly theatrical fashion. The culture of fear that this helps instill is something that Ukrainian officers who've been interviewed had pointed to as an explanation for why these prison recruits in Wagner have been willing to go forward to their almost certain death. Because almost certain isn't certain, and certain is what awaits them if they turn around and go back. In short, the organisation is culturally capable of extreme violence, whether that be against civilians in places like the Central African Republic or against their opponents in Ukraine. And yet, unlike so many Russian propagandists or pro-Russian commentators, Prigozhin will frequently laud the defensive efforts of the Ukrainians and compliment Ukrainian soldiers on their fighting techniques and determination. But looking too much at how Wagner fights misses a more important question, which is why Russia needs them at all. And to me, Wagner's importance and their mass deployment on the front is as much a warning sign about the future of the Russian military as the emergence of extremely old equipment from storage. And if you want to understand that, go back to the discussion at the start of why nations might hire mercenaries and also why mercenaries largely disappeared from conventional European service. Mercenaries are useful where the conventional national military is weak and not up to the task, where the nation needs it to solve a scalability problem, where it needs to ramp up quickly but doesn't have the capacity to do it, and where it needs to be able to absorb casualties without blowback from the domestic population. Wagner became useful because the regular Russian army wasn't up to the job. Wagner was useful because the army couldn't expand quickly enough, couldn't source manpower quickly enough, and Wagner could. Wagner was useful because the Russian military needed to suffer casualties that it didn't want to chalk up as its own. And Wagner was useful because the style of fighting had devolved to the point where it was the type of fighting that Wagner could do. Wagner isn't capable of armoured blitzkriegs. They don't have the training, the equipment, or the logistics. But supported by the logistical chain of the MOD itself, they do have the capacity to fight grinding infantry and artillery actions, which is exactly the nature of the fighting around places like Bakhmut. And perhaps most problematically, Wagner was useful because certain factions within the Russian government and power structure benefited from its strength. And as Wagner and Prigozhin's public profile and influence has risen, so too has the public conflict between them and the leaders at the Russian Ministry of Defense. Capturing Vuhledar was something that took the Russians one step closer to finally taking Bakhmut, and it's clear that Wagner were instrumental in doing so. Prigozhin took images and published images of himself in the Vuhledar salt mines, and the battle seemed to give Russia a success after a string of unmitigated defeats. You'd be forgiven for expecting that that's something the Russian Ministry of Defense would be happy about. But this is Russian politics, and things aren't so simple. Because succeeding is a political act, and as I've talked about before, politics can destroy armies. There was clearly no love lost between Prigozhin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu or Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. And his success, in the absence of other successes, was politically inconvenient. And political inconvenience can't be tolerated. Now, on one hand, Shoigu appears to have responded by trying to generate successes of his own. Despite being the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Shoigu is tightly linked with his own PMC, Patriot, and they were apparently, according to Ukrainian reports, present at Vuhledar. Not for the purpose of assaulting the town, no. They were apparently there so that after the town was taken, they could move in, raise the flag, and generate good publicity. Or so at least the reporting goes. But Vuhledar turned out to be an absolute train wreck. Hundreds of pieces of military equipment were lost, massive casualties were incurred, and the town held. And so, Wagner sources claim, unable to generate their own successes, Shoigu and some of the ministry conspired to take credit for some of Wagner's. And that effort, as well as the broader rivalry, played out openly on social media, something I've talked about in one of my previous videos. Official Russian MOD material credited apparent Wagner victories to units of the regular military and failed to mention Wagner almost entirely. Meanwhile, Wagner-linked channels or Prigozhin himself openly accused the Ministry of Defense of trying to claim credit for their military accomplishments. Now, I would always counsel caution when interpreting this kind of material. Technically speaking, both these factions are meant to be on the same side. This material could easily be agreed in advance and choreographed. It's theoretically possible this whole thing could be faked for the benefit of the cameras. But my big question there is, why? These statements foster rivalry and recrimination on the Russian side. And many of Prigozhin's statements are, by my understanding, completely illegal under Russian law as they actively discredit the Russian MOD. Heck, at times Prigozhin has gone so far as to suggest that some of the MOD may be engaged in treason as a result of their efforts to undermine the efforts of his Wagner Group. Wagner channels have even apparently been engaged in countering some Russian disinformation efforts. The term Russian bot is overused, often used to describe anyone in a comment section who expresses a pro-Russian opinion, but the idea of the Russian bot is very, very real. On Twitter, you might see, for example, dozens or hundreds of accounts that have no ostensible link to one another, all tweeting exactly the same message in rapid succession. "There is no panic in Balaklia" is a famous example of one of those messages that went out through dozens or hundreds of channels at basically the same time. Recently, there was such a release where a number of these channels all at the same time put out the fake news story that CNN had reported extremely high casualties for the Ukrainians. If you follow the information space, you'll see these stories occasionally. People like the Scott Ritters of the world or a number of these Twitter channels will put out fantastically high numbers for Ukrainian casualty estimates. In this case, it was that the Ukrainians have already suffered 250,000 dead. In one version of this story, the source was claimed to be the Israeli Mossad. In this case, the source was claimed to be CNN. They are, of course, complete bullshit as stories, but they do tend to get circulated. In any case, a Wagner-linked channel put together a screenshot of some of these posts and said the following: "I don't know where this nonsense about the enemy's losses come from. There is no such news on the American CNN indicated as the source, and the statistics themselves look especially delusional." And this isn't the first time it happened. I've seen Wagner-linked channels actively discredit claims by the Russian MOD as to, for example, the number of HIMARS systems that have been destroyed. They're actively fact-checking against their entire team, strategically deploying reality, I would suggest, in order to build credibility. If you go see pictures by get-rich-quick scammers on YouTube, many of them will begin by attacking other get-rich-quick scammers. And by doing so, they'll seek to build credibility in your mind for, well, their scam. I don't know whether that's exactly what Wagner is trying to do here, or whether they're just trying to do damage to some of these narratives. And given the importance of the information war, I wouldn't underestimate the impact of posts like this one. This is basically a case of trying to embarrass a teammate by arguing that the team is terrible and it's their fault. A rivalry, I would suggest, has to be pretty intense before that sort of maneuver makes sense. And in February 2023, it looked an awful lot like this rivalry had moved from a war of words into an active campaign of sabotage. Videos emerged of Russian troops calling the chief of the general staff of the Russian Federation things I can't repeat on YouTube, while Wagner forces claimed that the MOD had cut off their supply of both new prisoner recruits and also much of their supply of ammunition. If true, this is a critical moment in the relationship between Wagner and the MOD, so I wanted to have a look at it from multiple perspectives. I can't prove who's lying, I imagine they all are to some degree, but here's what the various actors are saying. In a series of audio recordings, posts and videos by Prigozhin and other linked channels, the claim was put forward that Wagner was receiving perhaps 20% of what it needed to advance in and capture Bakhmut. It was suggested that Wagner was losing hundreds of troops every day, and that losses were much higher than they would be with sufficient supply. Prigozhin even posed amongst the bodies of dead Wagner troops, suggesting a shortage of ammo was the reason for their deaths. They also published this ostensibly official document showing a request for ammunition Wagner's per-day estimated requirements next to the numbers of shells or various munitions that they had actually received in each category. I've got a version with basic Google Translate there. The key columns are the per 10-day column, which is the pink highlighted one in the middle, and the number actually received, which is the column on the far right. Now let's be clear, the rate of ammunition supply and ammunition requirements in an active battle zone is sensitive military information, and yet here it was being leaked in order to win a public argument. So how did the Russian Ministry of Defense respond? Well, basically by asserting that there was no war in Ba Sing Se. The ministry put out posts on its official Telegram channel that didn't refer to Wagner at all, just to volunteers or assault detachments in the Bakhmut area. They claimed that over the last year, 140% of requested ammunition had been supplied, and that those that were suggesting that ammunition supplies had been inadequate were trying to stoke division, that was dangerous and that they should stop. Then, because apparently we are now on the War Thunder forum, they too decided to release military statistics online. The MOD claimed that just over a 2-day period from February 18th to 20th, 2023, they had supplied 1,660 MLRS rockets, 10,171 heavy shells and mortar bombs, and 980 tank shells to the relevant units outside Bakhmut. That gives you an implied daily throughput of 6,405 rounds per day, just for Wagner around Bakhmut. At this point, I kind of want to put up a post accusing the Russian MOD of rank incompetence by putting all their ammunition depots in stupid locations, and I could rig up a basic map, just to see if they would then put up a rebuttal post with a map of all the genuine locations. I would be proven wrong, and Ukrainian HIMARS crews would have a fantastic opportunity. Now obviously both versions can't be true, so let's look at an account by a third party, Alexander Khodakovsky. Now remember, Khodakovsky is aligned with the DPR, keep that in mind. Now he has said that yes, Wagner is having their supplies of ammunition pulled back, but to a level that basically accords with what every other unit is getting. He claims that Wagner used to get special treatment, receiving far more ammunition and a priority over reinforcements and resources compared to everyone else. He even claims they used to have a daily ration of 2 Iskander and 1 caliber missiles, which is something that Wagner sources have refuted and also I've seen no evidence of. Because for that to be true, Wagner would have fired over the last several months the entire pre-war Russian inventory of Iskander missiles just at Bakhmut. He also claims that Wagner was given 2,500 anti-tank guided missiles for training and practice purposes. So he paints a middling picture, which is that yes, Wagner is having the supplies cut, but only to the same level as everyone else. But he obviously has an interest in this as well, because he claims that other assaults that he has been involved in or that other forces have launched, like the one at Vuhledar, he claims the reason those failed is because of inadequate ammunition supply. And one of the reasons for the inadequate ammunition supply, he claims, is Wagner's consumption. So just be aware that when you're looking at these Russian sources, that everyone has an agenda and everyone is likely looking for opportunities to make themselves look good or to excuse their failures. Now, when this was happening, many were quick to assert that this was the end of Wagner. The MOD was crushing Prigozhin and Wagner, and this was the end of them. That very obviously didn't happen. On the 23rd of February, Prigozhin announced that documents had been signed to resume the supply of ammunition. Ukrainians reported a re-intensification of firing at Bakhmut, and Wagner's attacks there appear to have re-intensified. So it looks like there's a truce between Wagner and the MOD for now, but that doesn't mean both sides are back to a status quo ante. The Russian MOD proved it has the capacity to choke off Wagner's supply of prisoner recruits and of ammunition. And while the resupply of ammunition has recommenced, the resupply of recruits hasn't. There's now talk of the Russian Ministry of Defense establishing its own penal units directly rather than allowing Wagner to recruit them. And Wagner sources complain that Russian media channels haven't been willing to take their money in exchange for placing recruitment ads in Russian media. So Wagner, it seems, hasn't been purged, but they are slowly being choked. Wagner's assault strategies are extremely costly in human terms. Prigozhin's comments and Western estimates both suggest that if they keep fighting them where they are and cannot recruit and cannot pull in new prisoners, then eventually the force is going to exhaust itself. That may be a significant loss for the Russian war effort, but it might also be a win for those who politically oppose Prigozhin. And in a system like the Russian one, given a choice between practicality and politics, there's every reason to choose politics. But even if Prigozhin has been squeezed, that doesn't mean others aren't going to try and emulate the success he has achieved with his Wagner PMC. Despite all the political conflicts and the tens of thousands of men who have likely died or been severely wounded in its service, Wagner has, I would argue, been a net win for Prigozhin. He's been catapulted to being a household name in Russia and abroad. He's likely grown wealthier off the back of its operations and also come to be the leader of a large group of very heavily armed and combat experienced men. So far as assets in power games go, that's a pretty good one. And so we should expect others to try and follow that same example. While Kadyrov rules Chechnya, for example, he has his own personal army, but he's already said that once he eventually leaves public service, he wants to start a PMC as well to follow Prigozhin's example. Other oligarch-linked PSCs or PMCs already exist and seem to be growing. Sergei Shoigu already has Patriot. It's reportedly smaller than Wagner, although it apparently pays better, and like Wagner has reportedly deployed to Syria and Ukraine. There is obviously nothing strange about any of this, because any healthy political system involves ministers accumulating their own private armies. And that's only if you focus on the big players. If you're willing to look down at the micro level, you'll find many, many more. Recently, even Gazprom was given the right to found its own private security company. The decree from 6th of February is there on screen. Initially, the force is ostensibly aimed at protecting critical infrastructure, but there is a question as to whether or not that role will expand over time. Armed men are armed men. And as Battletech fans will know, as soon as the phone company gets the right to form a mercenary group, we're all truly stuffed. But why does any of this matter? Why should you care? Why does it matter if various factions around Russia are arming up? Why does it matter if the military in 2022 heavily relied on PMCs like Wagner? And I suggest there are two reasons. The first is for what it tells us about the Russian military and its capabilities. You could argue Wagner was a massive support for the Russian military, but you could also argue it was a significant weakness. Wagner relies on facilities in Russia, recruits from Russia, and a logistics chain maintained by the Ministry of Defense. It doesn't build its own shells, it consumes those supplied to it by the MOD. When Wagner recruits from veterans or prisons, those are individuals who could have served in the Russian army. And diverting manpower and resources to these various duplicative forces takes away from the pool of resources that are available in order to improve the performance of the Russian military. It damages the cohesion of the overall force because of the growing rivalry between Wagner and the MOD and the open criticism that publicly flies between them. And those public disputes can have a very real impact on the credibility of the force. This video is proof of that. But I'd also argue that the way Wagner fights makes the idea of a decisive Russian victory all the less likely. Wagner's tactics, its equipment, its training, isn't designed for breakthrough operations and exploitation. It's designed for short-distance infiltration assaults. They take individual trenches, a hill, a position, a block. They're not capable of breaking through Ukrainian lines and then going 20 or 30 kilometers. Only regular MOD units might have that capability. But what that means is that in order to do a breakthrough and exploitation operation involving Wagner, Wagner and the MOD would need to cooperate very closely. And while that's possible, it's a pretty big ask given where relationships currently stand. From a Ukrainian perspective, this is probably a good thing. But here's the point that concerns me. Predicting politics in any country is difficult, let alone Russia, but it helps to be able to look through the lens of personal interest. What outcomes would benefit individual political leaders? And it's here that the proliferation of PMCs is particularly worrying. If you don't have a PMC, if you make your money in manufacturing or resource exports, then you're likely to want the war to end. You want international investment back, you want the European market back, you want to go back to being able to invest in property in London and holidaying on the French Riviera. But if your financial future and your influence depends on PMC operations, well then war is now your business. The war in Ukraine can become an opportunity to do what Prigozhin has done, which is take money from the public purse and funnel it into his own pocket while building his public profile off the back of military action. The rise of state-sponsored PMCs increases the influence, power, and motivation of individuals who will want the war to keep going. And given that many Russian PMCs are tightly linked with right-wing extremism, well, then it's possible the influence of those ideological blocs will grow as well. Because they're the ones making money, they're the ones providing critical security services to the state, and they're the ones with the armed men willing to follow their instructions. It's possible, of course, that Wagner is throttled, begins to fade away, and few of these other PMCs come to much. But there is a chance that more and more of the Russian elite come to see war as good for business, with all the potentially frightening implications that has. In conclusion, PMCs occupy a particular position in Russian strategy. And while they've been used for years to support Russian deployments around the world, Wagner's combat role in Ukraine has been something different. Their combat record there and around the world has been mixed. But it has been enough to catapult Prigozhin to public prominence. And while the sustainability and future of Wagner as a major combat force remains uncertain, it seems very possible that other Russian political figures or power blocs will see reason to emulate him, both to fill apparent capability gaps in the current Russian army, but also to secure their own political influence and standing. Whether that's ultimately to the benefit of the Russian state and the Russian military, however, remains open to debate, because as history shows, it's not without reason that most states turned away from mercenaries for frontline combat duties. Alright, channel update to close out. And I'm aware this episode has been in the works for a while, so I hope people enjoyed it. So far as the channel update goes, there's really only one thing I want to say this week. Exactly a year ago, I released All Bling No Basics, my first video on Ukraine. Listening to it again, it was a relatively rough around the edges affair. The sound quality was scratchy, the editing wasn't quite there, and I was so motivated to just get the thoughts out there that I didn't give myself much time to pull together material, make it pretty before I published it online. I thought it was going to be a flash in the pan. I didn't think that I could make an influence on the wider information space. Hour-long slideshow presentations on military procurement strategy aren't something I thought would have a wider audience. But 1 year later, here we are. And the reason we're here is because the immense support that this channel has received from every one of you. Now, personally, I hope that tomorrow the war is over, the world as a whole is at peace, and this sort of content becomes obsolete. But unless or until that happens, I intend to keep doing what I'm doing. And to those of you who make it possible for me to do so, well, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you once again, and I'll see you all next week.